Christmas morning is supposed to be protected. A rare pause in royal life where schedules loosen, protocol softens, and children are allowed to exist without being measured against destiny. Inside Kensington Palace, the day was meant to begin with quiet footsteps in the hallway, muffled laughter, and the familiar chaos of wrapping paper and excitement. But before the sun had fully risen over London, that sense of safety cracked. At exactly 6:32 a.m., Prince William received a message that was never meant to reach him. It didn't come through official palace channels. It wasn't filtered, approved, or carefully worded. It was direct, urgent, and deeply unsettling. A trusted staff member, someone who had served the family for years, had broken protocol for one reason only. William needed to know what had been said about his children behind closed doors. The message was short, but its meaning was heavy. It suggested that while William and Catherine were focused on protecting their children's sense of normalcy, others inside the palace had been quietly discussing their future without permission. Not schedules, not appearances, but upbringing, development, interventions. Words that don't belong anywhere near childhood, let alone the lives of 3 young children. As William reread the message, the warmth of Christmas morning drained away. Whatever had happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't family gossip. It was deliberate. And it carried the unmistakable tone of authority being exercised where it didn't belong. What made the situation even more disturbing was who the warning came from. This wasn't a reckless leak or an opportunistic whisper. The staff member who reached out was known for discretion, loyalty, and silence. Someone who understood the unspoken rules of palace life and the cost of breaking them. For that person to step outside those boundaries meant something serious had already gone too far. And as William sat alone in the early morning stillness, listening to the palace slowly wake around him, he realized this wasn't about public image or internal politics anymore. This was about his role as a father, colliding head-on with an institution that had never fully learned where its authority should end. Because once children become subjects of strategy instead of care, nothing inside a family stays intact for long. And what William was about to uncover would force him to confront a truth no future king wants to face. Sometimes the greatest threat to your family doesn't come from the outside world. It comes from within the walls meant to protect you. To understand why that message carried so much weight, you have to look at what had been quietly unfolding in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Nothing explosive at first. No open arguments. Just small moments that lingered longer than they should have. Comments that felt unnecessary. Corrections that weren't asked for. Observations framed as concern, but delivered with an edge that suggested judgment. Inside royal circles, these moments are easy to dismiss as tradition, as generational difference, as the inevitable friction that comes with family and hierarchy colliding. That's exactly what William and Catherine tried to believe at first. The earliest unease surfaced during a private family gathering in early November. It was meant to be informal, one of those rare occasions where titles softened and conversation drifted away from duty. But during a quiet exchange at the table, Queen Camilla made a remark about one of the children that landed differently than intended. The words themselves weren't harsh. They were familiar, even traditional. But the tone carried something else: authority, expectation, an implication that guidance already being given wasn't quite enough. Catherine noticed it immediately. William didn't, not at first. He brushed it off as overthinking, the kind of comment generations of royals had grown up hearing. Except it didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, similar moments began stacking on top of one another. A suggestion that discipline needed to be firmer. A passing remark about emotional softness, a comment implying that kindness, while admirable, could become a weakness in royal life. None of it was said loudly. None of it was confrontational. That was the problem. It all lived in the margins, delivered just quietly enough to avoid challenge, but consistently enough to reshape the narrative around how the children were being raised. Catherine felt it first, a mother's instinct picking up on something that didn't sit right. She noticed changes in how conversations unfolded, how guidance was offered without being requested, how certain looks lingered a second too long. She mentioned it to William more than once, careful not to sound accusatory, careful not to turn discomfort into conflict. William listened, but like many who've grown up inside institutions built on endurance. He initially framed it as noise rather than threat. The palace had always been full of opinions. This felt like more of the same. What neither of them realized was that these weren't isolated moments at all. They were signals. By late November, palace staff had begun to notice the pattern too. Conversations happening behind doors that normally stayed closed. Advisors being consulted about topics that usually remained firmly in the hands of parents. Language shifting from affection to assessment, from care to correction. And while nothing had been announced, nothing written, the direction was becoming clear to those paying close attention. The tension crossed into something harder to ignore the night one of the children came home quieter than usual, not upset, not angry, just careful. Catherine sensed it immediately. When she asked what had been said earlier that day, the response was hesitant, rehearsed in a way no child should ever sound. A sentence delivered as if it had been taught. A suggestion that being useful mattered more than being happy. That kindness might not be enough for people like them. That was the moment Catherine stopped questioning her instincts. Because children don't invent those ideas on their own. That night, she told William everything. Not just the recent incident, but the accumulation of moments she had tried to downplay for weeks. The comments, the corrections, the subtle but steady pressure pushing their children toward roles instead of identities. William didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. He didn't rationalize. He listened. And when she finished, the silence that followed carried a different weight than before. Something had shifted. What they didn't know yet was that while they were having this conversation inside Kensington Palace, plans were already moving forward elsewhere. Conversations were becoming meetings. Opinions were becoming proposals. And decisions about their children's futures were being discussed in rooms where neither parent had been invited. And that's where Christmas Eve enters the story. If you want, I'll continue straight into the secret meeting setup next. Or tighten this section slightly to sharpen the cliffhanger before moving on. Christmas Eve at Buckingham Palace is usually ceremonial on the surface and routine underneath. Final briefings, last-minute logistics, carefully timed appearances. Nothing dramatic, nothing personal. But behind the palace's thick walls, away from the cameras and carols, a meeting was taking shape that would append everything William and Catherine believed was protected ground. It took place in one of the palace's most private rooms, a space reserved for conversations considered too sensitive to circulate. Attendance was limited. No announcements were made. No records were meant to travel far. According to accounts shared later by those who witnessed the aftermath, the discussion centered on one thing: the future of the Wales children. Not their schedules, not holiday appearances, but who should have influence over how they were being shaped for what. Lay ahead, those present framed the conversation carefully. This wasn't, they claimed, about criticism. It was about preparedness, about tradition, about responsibility to the institution. The concern, as it was reportedly described, was that the children were being raised with too much emphasis on normal life and not enough exposure to what the crown would eventually demand. Especially the boy whose future had already been written long before he could understand it. The language used was measured, almost clinical. Strengths were acknowledged before concerns were introduced, but the underlying message was unmistakable. William and Catherine's approach. Their insistence on protecting childhood and emotional stability was being quietly reframed as a potential risk, something that might need correcting before it became permanent. Charlotte's name entered the discussion next. Observations about her confidence, her curiosity, her independence, qualities praised in public, but privately recast as traits that would need careful managing within the royal hierarchy. The suggestion, according to reports, was that guidance should begin sooner rather than later. Not harsh, not overt, just enough to ensure she understood her place, and then there was learned how to navigate it without disrupting the balance of the future reign. Words that, when applied to a child barely old enough to tie his own shoes, revealed more about the institution than the boy himself. What should have been recognized as personality was instead treated as a behavior problem waiting to surface. What shocked those who later learned of the meeting wasn't concern alone. It was what came next. The discussion reportedly shifted from observation to action. Proposals were outlined. Structured guidance, carefully selected tutors, increased access from advisors who specialized in protocol and royal conditioning, all framed as support, all presented as helpful. But nowhere in the conversation was there meaningful acknowledgement that these decisions belonged to the children's parents. That omission mattered, because once authority is assumed without consent, the line between support and control disappears. As the meeting wrapped up, responsibilities were assigned. Notes were taken. Timelines were discussed. The assumption seemed to be that these ideas would be presented after the holidays. Once emotions had settled and tradition could be invoked as justification, no resistance was expected, no confrontation anticipated. What no one in that room accounted for was the person standing quietly nearby, someone whose job placed them close enough to hear everything, but whose loyalty had always been to the children themselves. Someone who had watched William grow up inside the same walls, who had seen what pressure did to young royals when no one stepped in early enough. That person understood immediately what the meeting represented. And before Christmas Eve had even ended, a decision was made. The kind of decision that carries consequences no matter which way it goes. Say nothing and allow lines to be crossed quietly. Or break every rule that keeps the palace running smoothly and warn a father before it's too late. By the time London settled into sleep and Christmas morning edged closer, the evidence was already being secured. Notes remembered, details preserved, and a message prepared that would reach Prince William just hours later. The moment he read it, everything changed. If you want, I'll continue directly into William's Christmas morning confrontation and the fallout, or adjust the intensity up or down before moving forward. By the time Christmas morning fully arrived, the palace was already operating on borrowed time. William didn't wake his children. He didn't turn on the lights or let the day begin the way it was supposed to. Instead, he sat alone, the weight of what he'd just learned settling into something colder and far more dangerous than shock. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't palace chatter. It was written, documented, planned, and the more he read, the clearer it became that this wasn't a conversation meant to include him later. It was a decision already in motion. He left Kensington Palace quietly, offering Catherine only a brief explanation. Enough for her to understand that this wasn't something that could wait, but not enough to frighten the children. They agreed without discussion. One of them would protect the morning. The other would confront the threat. William arrived at Buckingham Palace earlier than expected, bypassing the usual rhythms of Christmas Day. Staff sensed it immediately. The way he moved, the absence of ceremony, the stillness in his expression. He wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. There was no rush, no visible agitation, just a focus so precise it made people step out of his path without being asked. The staff member who had sent the message met him away from the main corridors. Their account filled in the gaps the documents couldn't. Who was present? What tone was used? How casually parental authority had been discussed as something flexible, optional. When the explanation ended, William asked only one thing: where the meeting's architect was now. He didn't knock when he reached the door. That detail would matter later. In a world built on protocol, refusing to announce yourself is its own kind of declaration. The room fell silent the moment he stepped inside. Whatever greeting was forming on the other side never had time to land. William placed the papers down slowly, not thrown, not slammed. Just enough force to make the point unavoidable. The words that followed weren't raised, but they carried, clear, controlled, final. He made it unmistakably clear that he knew everything. The assessments, the proposals, the assumptions, and as he spoke, something else became clear as well. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a boundary being drawn with surgical precision. For minutes that felt far longer, he spoke uninterrupted. About his children as people, not symbols. About the damage caused when childhood is treated as preparation instead of protection. About the cost of growing up under constant correction. He didn't need to name history for it to be understood. Everyone in that room knew exactly which ghosts were being invoked. When the response came, it was framed as concern, responsibility, experience. But none of it landed. Because the core issue had already been exposed. Decisions about his children had been made without him, and that, more than anything else, was the line that could never be uncrossed. William's terms were delivered without hesitation. No private access. No unsupervised conversations. No programs, no advisors, no assessments disguised as support. Any future interaction would happen on his terms or not at all. The finality in his voice left no room for negotiation. By the time the door opened again, the situation had already moved beyond repair. Others entered the room, drawn by the gravity of what was unfolding. Unity formed quickly and unmistakably, not out of strategy, but out of instinct. And within minutes, the conflict had escalated into something far larger than a family disagreement, because once those boundaries were spoken aloud, there was no version of the monarchy that could return to how it functioned before. What followed wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was irreversible, and within hours, the palace itself would begin to change. If you want, I'll continue into the emergency family meeting and long-term fallout, or slow this moment down even further for maximum emotional impact before moving on. The emergency meeting came together faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, word had reached the only person who could no longer stay on the sidelines. King Charles III arrived to a room already charged with tension, where nothing had been resolved and everything had been exposed. The atmosphere wasn't chaotic, it was controlled in the most unsettling way. Everyone present understood that this was no longer about misunderstanding or bruised egos. It was about authority and who truly held it when children were involved. William stood his ground without raising his voice. Catherine joined him moments later, her presence changing the dynamic instantly. There was no need for speeches, no dramatic gestures. The unity between them spoke louder than anything that could have been said. This wasn't a negotiation between households. It was a declaration that their family would not be managed from the outside. The discussion that followed stretched on far longer than anyone planned. Attempts were made to soften language, to reframe intentions, to suggest compromise. But every effort ran into the same immovable truth. Trust had already been broken, and once that happens, intention stops mattering. Catherine spoke quietly, but when she did, the room fell still. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize. She spoke about what it does to a child to feel evaluated instead of accepted, about the questions that start forming when authority figures suggest love isn't enough, about how easily confidence fractures when children begin measuring themselves against expectations they didn't choose. The damage, she explained, doesn't appear all at once. It settles in slowly, and by the time it's visible, it's already shaped who they become. That was the moment the conversation changed, because suddenly this wasn't about protocol or precedent. It was about repeating history, and no one in that room needed to name the past out loud to feel its weight pressing in. When Charles finally asked what would be required to move forward, the answer came without hesitation. Boundaries, enforced ones, no unsupervised access, no behind-the-scenes guidance, no private messaging disguised as mentorship. Any attempt to bypass parental authority would end contact immediately, not temporarily, permanently. The silence that followed was heavy, not because the terms were unclear, but because everyone understood what accepting them meant. The family would no longer function as a single, fluid unit. There would be lines, and those lines wouldn't fade with time. The decision, when it came, was quiet, formal, final. The boundaries would stand. By the time the meeting ended, the palace was no longer operating as it had the day before. Staff adjusted, without being told. Schedules shifted. Access tightened. Information stopped flowing freely. The separation wasn't announced, but it was felt everywhere. In the way conversations paused when certain names were mentioned, in the way movement through the palace became more deliberate, more monitored. And while the public saw none of it, those inside understood something fundamental had changed. Because once a future king chooses his children over tradition, the institution has to adapt, or fracture. And the real consequences of that choice were only just beginning to surface. If you want, I can continue into the quiet aftermath and long-term implications, or sharpen this section further to heighten tension before the fallout.